Once again, welcome to our virtual Sangha. I use that term quite freely these days, and a few days ago my one granddaughter asked me who Virgil was that I kept referring to. So I just said, he's a friend of mine, Virgil Sangha. We don't know. We don't know. We don't have enough information. We're still studying that. We're not quite sure what to do right now. Have you heard those words before? Probably many, many times a day. And we hear them from what we call experts. Many of them are experts. But we're so used to the experts having the answers. We're so used to the people in charge having the answers. And it's really ironic that today in this world where we can say, hey Google or Alexa or Siri and get the answer to any question we have, that we hear, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. So this, whether we're aware of it or not, creates a considerable anxiety in the human mind and in our culture. The mind does not like not knowing. The mind does not like not knowing. It's, you might say, painful to the mind. Uncertainty and not knowing. The mind craves the familiar, the tried and the true. We have a certain feeling of familiarity, coming home, feeling safe. And we shrink, the mind shrinks from the experience of not knowing. It's very uncomfortable. Because today, understanding and planning and controlling and predicting and data and analytics and these are the gears that turn the engine of today's world. Information age we live in, the age of knowledge. Yet it's ironic that there's very little, if anything, we can do to predict or control the future. Most of what happens to us collectively and individually are things that we have not predicted, things that we've not been able to control in spite of all our machinations. We use planning as a buffer. You know, we make plans, we have schedules, and you probably have heard the old joke about how to make God laugh. You know, tell her your plans. You know, sometimes I say life is what happens when we're busy planning something else. So the mind doesn't like this. In fact, the mind will create all sorts of fantasies, all sorts of stories. Will conjure up all sorts of imaginary fictionary facts. To fill in the void, the vacuum. As you well know, if there's something we don't know, why, right away there's going to be rumors, there's going to be gossip, there's going to be conspiracy theories, because nobody knows, and we can't stand just not knowing. We have to fill up that vacuum. And most psychologists, and a lot of us that are not psychologists, will tell you that the old mind, the subconscious mind, will cling to outmoded beliefs and memories and experiences, even though they don't work anymore, even though they may even be causing us considerable amount of suffering. The mind goes to these and clings to these because they're familiar. We cling to the familiar, even if it's painful, even if it causes much suffering. I think the mantra, the unrecognized mantra of most of us is the old adage, better the devil you know. We'd rather face the devil we know than the God that we don't know. This aversion to not knowing probably has its origin in our drive for self-preservation. If we go back to the good old days when we lived in the savannah, in the forest, the bush country, to not know something could be life-threatening. What you don't know may eat you. So survival was based upon awareness and understanding. And if you're hunting or if you're raising crops, knowledge and the ability to predict can make the difference between life and death. So knowing has become part of our survival mechanism. And so to not know touches the most primal part of us. And yet, interestingly enough, there are some spiritual practices that not only tolerate not knowing, but cultivate a state of not knowing. The don't know mind is a term that's often used in Korean Zen. And the Japanese Zen master Suzuki Roshi, the founder of the Zen Center in San Francisco many, many years ago, almost 70 years ago, back in the late 50s, he developed this term called beginner's mind, which is the mind of the newborn, the mind of not knowing, the mind of innocence, the mind of freshness, the mind of not knowing anything. Beginner's mind is the mind that's fresh and new and teachable. So as it turns out, the greatest of all survival mechanisms is not the ability to know, but the ability to learn. One of my favorite quotes is by the American philosopher Eric Hoffer, who says, in times of change, the learners, the teachable, will inherit the earth. Whereas the learned, the experts, will have a great deal of knowledge about a world that no longer exists. And so as we cling to what we know, very often we're clinging to a fiction, to a world that's gone by. Because the world we live in is always fresh and anew and open. So the practice of don't know mind is to really, quite simply, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in Korean Zen or Zen itself for that matter, but the practice as I understand it is to live in the reality that we truly don't know what the future holds. The next 5 minutes, the next 5 hours, the next 5 days, months, or years, we don't know. And to simply allow yourself to feel whatever you feel as you sit in that reality. I don't know. I don't know when I will die. I don't know when the next virus will show up. I don't know when the economy will crash or grow, or when my work will be present or not present, or my bank account be full or empty. I truly don't know. Nor does anyone. So we allow ourselves to feel whatever we feel, and typically it's anxiety, but not always. Whatever it is, allow it to arise. Allow these emotions to arise. And very often, instead of emotions, we find ourselves going into a lot of mental activity. So pay attention. Pay attention to when the mind jumps out of the present moment, jumps into planning, daydreaming, fantasizing. Future. Oftentimes we rehearsing and planning, anticipating. And when that happens, let yourself feel the feeling underneath that. The anxiety, the fear, whatever it is. Notice the feeling that arises just before the mind jumps into the future. If you find yourself rehearsing something, see if you can see what precipitated that thought. See if you can breathe and let yourself let go of that thought and feel the underpinning of it. What do I feel if I don't rehearse that speech that I'm going to give? Or what do I feel if I don't rehash that argument I had with my spouse last night? Or whatever it is. Be aware of these feelings as they arise. And the more in touch we are with the feelings, with the sensations in the body, the more present we are in the moment, we can begin to feel the feeling as it arises, and then the mind does not jump into the future. Then we're not escaping the future, but living in the present. And ironically, the best way to live in the present moment is to see how and when we escape out of the present moment, or try to, that is. How we try to escape into the future or into the past. How we escape into some story about what is, rather than simply living in the experience of what is. Noticing the types of thoughts that arise. You know, if you find yourself rehashing the past a lot, notice what's underneath that. What feelings do you have if you momentarily stop that? Very often when we get fixated on the past, there's some unacknowledged grief or remorse or maybe even guilt. Very good to see this and feel it, because the feeling is the healing. The rehashing doesn't do any good whatever. It simply covers up the feeling. But we can get fixated on this, and this becomes a pattern that we live for years and years and years. Not really present to our life, but being controlled by the ghost of the past or the future. So the intention of the practice of Don't Know Mind in its original form is that of liberation, as are all the Buddhist practices. Liberation from suffering, liberation from the attachment to the ego, liberation from delusion. And yet there's some practical benefits that come from this as well. And we don't typically talk a lot about the practical benefits out of concern that people will do the practice to try to get something. But ironically, when we do the practice without trying to get something, we begin to see the fruits of the practice. And some of the fruits of this practice are that we may find ourselves living more spontaneously. We may find ourselves living more effectively. Have you ever had the experience where you've done something spontaneously and you thought, gee, that was more effective than if I planned it or rehearsed it? We begin to trust life as it unfolds in the moment. We recognize that not knowing creates the space for creative awareness. Not knowing creates the space for something new. The only way to create something truly new is to fully let go of what we think we know now. One of my teachers would say, when you go to that place of not knowing, when you let go of everything that you think you know, then you go to the place where all worlds are born. Then you go to the place that's the very root of creativity. And it's possible to live in that place, fully alive, fully spontaneous. So, as difficult as it is in these times of uncertainty, it can also be used as a very profound spiritual practice, and it can be used as a way to practice living more spontaneously and creatively. And the suffering that we face can be used to overcome suffering if we use it wisely. And it's up to you, and it's up to me, depending on how we choose to live each moment. So thank you for being with us for this practice. I honor the truth of who you are.